And good morning again. And before we get to the controversy over Bob Woodward's book, some late news. Pictures turned up overnight of Mohammed Atta. He is the lead pilot, you'll remember, who flew one of the planes that crashed into the World Trade Tower. Pictures taken a full year and a half before the attack, we're told. We're also told that the pictures were taken in Afghanistan and they were for release after the 9/11 attacks and Atta's death. What this underlines, of course, is just how early they had begun planning the attack and how far along they were, a full year and a half before they struck. Now to today's story. Bob Woodward has written 10 books in a row that wound up #1 on the bestseller list. He always has the part of the inside story that we didn't know about, and he's apparently done it again. He says the administration has not been telling the truth on Iraq. In an interview to be broadcast tonight on 60 Minutes, he talks about it with Mike Wallace.
When you say the Bush administration has not told the truth about Iraq, what do you mean?
I think probably the most prominent example is the level of violence.
Not just the growing sectarian violence, Sunnis against Shias, that gets reported every day.
We need a leader!
But attacks on U.S. and allied forces. Woodward says that's the most important measure of violence in Iraq, and he unearthed this graph, classified secret, that shows those attacks have increased dramatically over the last 3 years.
Getting to the point now where there are 800-900 attacks a week. That's more than 100 a day. 4 attacks an hour attacking our forces.
The president's top communications man, Dan Bartlett, will be here in a minute to talk about all this. But before we get to him, we want to get a Democrat's view of this. Senator Joe Biden, of course, is the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's with us this morning. And, Senator, before we talk about Iraq and what's going on there, I want to ask you about another passage in this book, because Bob Woodward says that in 2001, in July, that is before the attacks on 9/11, the CIA Director George Tenet and his top counterterrorism man, Cofer Black, asked for basically an emergency appointment with Condoleezza Rice, the president's national security advisor, and they told her that they believed that al-Qaeda was going to attack us in this country. Now, as far as I know, this was not known about until Bob Woodward published this book. I'd want to ask you, did you know about this as the top Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee, and what do you make of this?
Bob, I did know about it. There are all kinds of rumors to that effect. But it raises 2 really important questions. If that meeting really did take place, why didn't Condi Rice or George Tenet tell the 9/11 Commission about that? They were obliged to do that, and they didn't. And the second thing it raises is if they left this unprotected there, it forces us to focus now. I mean, the 9/11 Commission report is out there telling us what we have to do to protect ourselves, and this administration has done virtually nothing to implement the recommendations of the 9/11 report. So the real scandal will be, if God forbid we're attacked again, why did they sit in their hands for the last 3 years and not do anything about chemical plants, not do anything about a number of other things that the 9/11 Commission report urgently says we have to do?
Well, apparently this meeting was not known about by the 9/11 Commission. You said, if I understood you, you did not know about it.
Correct.
It's hard to see what happened here because Tenet and Cofer Black say, according to this book, that they went away from this meeting feeling that they had been basically ignored and brushed off.
Well, I think there's a lot of evidence of that in other meetings as well, and subsequent meetings. But the point here is that if this, in fact, did occur, and take Woodward at his word that he has proof that it did occur, then Dr. Rice, Secretary of State Rice, did not meet her obligation to the 9/11 Commission, and George Tenet did not meet his obligation. They were obliged to tell the 9/11 Commission, when they were investigating, of all relevant meetings that took place relevant to the attack on 9/11. This sure sounds relevant to me. Why did they not do that?
Now, Dan Bartlett, the president's communications chief, who will be here in a minute, says, and he said it again this morning on another broadcast, that the president retains confidence in Don Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense. Woodward's book, over and over, says that Rumsfeld many times is at odds with other members of the administration. It even goes so far as to say that Andy Card, then the president's chief of staff, tried on several occasions to have Rumsfeld replaced. What do you know about that?
Well, that's my understanding as well. Bob, I was on your program right after Abu Ghraib. I called for Rumsfeld's resignation. I went down to the White House to meet with the president and the vice president in the Oval Office. The president said to me, quote, "Why you keep picking on Rummy?" I looked at the president. I said, "Mr. President, with all due respect," and I looked at the vice president, "Mr. Vice President, I would call for your resignation as well, of were you not a constitutional officer." And the president said, "Why would you say that?" And I said, "Mr. President, not one piece of advice either Don Rumsfeld or Dick Cheney has given you has turned out to be correct with regard to Iraq." And the president just seems completely wedded to the notion. But it's way beyond Rumsfeld now. Rumsfeld's resignation is almost irrelevant now. The issue is, what is the president of the United States going to do about changing direction and policy in Iraq? He obviously has bought onto Rumsfeld and Cheney's notion. He's rejected the notion of everyone else in this administration, not everyone, others with a different view. It's the president's responsibility. He's got to change, staying the course and saying we're not going to stand down till the Iraqi troops stand up, when the issue is getting them to stand together. There's 600,000 plus armed troops in Iraq, Bob. 600,000 trained. And there's more violence.
Did you just say that you would have called for the president's recommendation, had that been constitutionally possible, when you called for...
Yeah.
You told the president that to his face?
I told the president, with Dick Cheney right there. I was straightforward.
What did they say?
It's not They just looked at me like I was crazy. I mean, look, this isn't about... It's not personal. When the president asked me why, I said, "Can you name me one piece of advice, with all due respect, Mr. President? One piece of advice you've gotten on a major issue relating to Iraq from the vice president or from the Secretary of Defense that's turned out to be correct."
Well, Senator Biden, are you saying, do you think the president ought to resign?
No, not. I didn't say the president, the vice president.
Oh, the vice president.
I said to the president, I said, with all due respect, Mr. President, and I looked over at Dick Cheney and I said, "Mr. Vice President, I'm not only called for Rumsfeld's resignation. Were you not a constitutional officer, I would suggest you resign." I didn't mean he literally should resign. I was making the point.
Well, do you think he ought to resign? Do you think the vice president ought to resign?
No.
Okay.
I was making the point that these guys just don't know what they're doing, and no one takes them seriously anymore, except the president, apparently.
The president said the Democratic Party, and I will quote here, "the party of Roosevelt and Truman has now become the party of cut and run." And he says Democrats offer nothing but criticism and obstruction and endless second guessing.
That is absolutely not true. Absolutely false. I've been on your show today in the lead editorial in the Philadelphia Inquirer, in every major newspaper in America. I've offered a detailed plan. I've gone down and talked about it. Everyone knows we need a political settlement here, Bob. My plan, and many Democrats have embraced and many Democratic candidates have embraced, says you got to give breathing room to the Kurds, the Shia, and the Sunnis with a federal city called Baghdad. Let them have their own regions within this federation. Give the Sunnis a piece of the oil and have an American force stay over the horizon to keep the neighbors from interfering. That's a political solution. You may disagree with it. An awful lot of people agree. But it is an offer of a reasonable way that we can responsibly take our troops home. The president is I think, wallowing now in a combination of there's within the administration, Bob, and all your sources, ask them. They are completely at odds with one another. They have no idea what to do next. As I said, there's 600,000 plus trained forces by us, counting our forces. Things are getting worse and worse. It's spiraling out of hand. There's a political solution needed, and the president is doing nothing about it. He is the one should cut the old program and run on a new program. No one has cut and run. Nobody in the Democratic Party's call for the immediate withdrawal of those forces. We're calling for some sanity and recognition of reality. There's a civil war spiraling out of control, and all the king's horses and all the king's men will not be able to hold Iraq together if it becomes a full-blown civil war. There's a need for a political solution.
All right. Well, Senator Biden, I think that's a good point to stop. And when we come back, we'll get what the White House thinks about all of this and what you've just said. Dan Bartlett will be here next.